Everybody, thanks so much for listening to another episode of Fire Breathing Rob. If you're listening to us on the radio and one of the 20 stations, I really appreciate that. If you are listening to us on the video stream, thanks so much. We are on YouTube, and definitely subscribe. If this is your first time, we appreciate you listening. Definitely subscribe, like I said, and definitely hit the bell because you do get those notifications when we do put up different interviews. We interview people of politics, sports, lifestyle issues, and pretty much everything that's going on in the country right now we've dabbled into. So I appreciate you guys for listening. Today we have Professor Earl Brown, and he is out in Canada at the University of Ottawa, and he has dealt with viruses as a virologist. We're going to really kick it around into the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to talk about the vaccines in general, and also talk about, which has been a hot topic here in this country right now, the vaccine hesitancy, but also after somebody gets the vaccine, what they should be feeling and how long that'll last. So again, Professor Brown, I appreciate you coming on. Thanks so much for this.
Oh, good to be here, Robert.
All right. But can you take us back to March and what the differences you saw from America to Canada as far as, how America shut down and the differences between Canada and America in general as far as the vaccine?
So I think we're talking about March when they first declared the pandemic. New virus showed up in China, kicked them around pretty bad, and China took it real seriously, which sort of caught my attention. China often doesn't overreact, but you might have said they overreacted, but maybe they didn't. They shut down the whole country. And also where it hit in Wuhan, they had a heck of a time. The hospitals were swamped. People couldn't get care. It was killing quite a few people. So, and then it got into Europe. Italy had a heck of a time. They were really shut down for a lot. Spain, and then it came to North America. We had longer time to look at it. And then when it came to Canada, we shut down pretty quick. We went into lockdown. Everybody just stay home except for essential activities. Stores were restricted, only essential activities, that sort of thing. The US was a little bit slower to come along. As you mentioned, there was politics came up in there. And so unfortunately, things got a little bit muddier in the US, where all the science sort of went through a bit more of a political filter. Up in Canada, I'd say it was a bit more, scientists had a bit more of the reins, and the scientists, what they said was listened to a bit stronger, especially initially, if you want to talk about a difference north and south of the border. But we went into lockdown, and really they shut the hospitals down for all elective surgeries, but the hospitals were almost empty. They essentially stopped it going. But then they came off the first lockdown and they opened up. Did not bad in the summer, but then in the fall, all of a sudden everything started whooshing up again, because they opened the schools, they opened the businesses. Everybody was business as usual, and we couldn't quite handle it. Too much virus. And the hospitals were getting up to the point where you're filling your ICUs. And so you had people saying, well, let her run, well, you have to be able to take care of the sick. And so when the hospital guys yell, whoa, we can't handle this, then that's when you have to sort of lock things down and get things in place somewhat. And everybody was waiting for the vaccine. Vaccines showed up with 12 months after the virus showed up, essentially, and got licensing. That was amazing. And that's really the strength of modern science. Biology can do a lot more than they could 20 years ago. And so we got a new pandemic, and they whipped up all these vaccines, new technologies, mRNA vaccines, never used before. It makes people nervous. They're working very well, but a new thing on the block, it's like, I'm not going to be the first one on that thing. You ride it first, and then I'll try it, And so, I have a lot of that thinking, which is understandable, right?
Right.
But
go ahead.
Then we did get the vaccine, and we've been pushing to get people vaccinated, trying to get enough vaccine, and that's sort of where we are right now.
So it sounds like before, I'm just talking about American politics right now. It sounds like, everybody in America was saying it was from the bats, and people were eating bats in China and this and that. And that's how it got into the system. Now, and everybody said that the lab leak was a conspiracy theory. It wasn't true. Now we're seeing President Biden come out and say that he wants to investigate this because it could be true. We're also seeing the former CDC director come out and say that he believes this is true. What is your opinion on this as a virologist? Does this make you skeptical now that maybe this was the case, that they've been working on this and it just escaped through a person and that's how it triggered everything to go haywire?
Well, sure, there's certain opinions out there, as you mentioned, Robert, and then you sort of have to go back, what are the facts?
Sure.
The facts we've got. And so right now we've got very strong circumstantial evidence about this high containment lab in Wuhan. Right. So you've got a pandemic breaks out, first cluster is within a kilometer of this institution. It's one of their outdoor markets there where they sell live animals and that sort of thing. And so people are saying, well, gee, they work on coronaviruses there, that's their center. Right. The closest relative of this virus from bats they have in that institute. But that virus did not start this pandemic. That virus from bats, if you look at its nucleotides, the letters in its code, it's 96% identical to this SARS coronavirus number 2 that causes COVID-19. So that's close, but it takes evolution 40 years to get through that much change. You change about 1% per year. So there's 40 years of evolution that's gone on between this bat virus and this coronavirus that's causing COVID-19 disease. And so that's not the virus. So people are saying, well, they had it in the lab, they massaged it, they ran it through animals, they genetically modified it, blah, blah, blah. So you say, well, okay, if you look at that virus, you look at the sequence of it, you look at the letters of the code, it doesn't look like it's been manipulated. Mind you, that doesn't mean, that's not a slam dunk in any stretch. It just means you can't see marks on it. And there's different ways to do genetic modifications. And one of them is to adapt these viruses to animals and make them strong killers in animals or in human cells, that sort of thing. They mutate along the way, a lot like these variants that we're probably going to get in and talk to you later. Right. You can get clusters of mutations that change. But there's still a lot of change, a lot of mutations to account for. And what you really have to see, if you want to say, well, this virus came out of the lab, you have to find this virus in the lab before it was out in nature infecting people in China. First reports from December, maybe you can push that back to November, but they don't have any isolates, don't have any virus from that time. And so really what you want to see is this virus in a lab setting, in a tube somewhere, and show, well, they had it in the lab and, well, maybe it got out. But what you don't have is any evidence that this virus, this SARS coronavirus number 2, was in that lab. And so circumstantial evidence is strong, specific evidence is not there right now. Right. And so, you know, you've got the thing that was closest relative was in a bat. We can all agree on that. And then how did it get to be our new pandemic? That's where the question comes. And so the virus is in humans. We see the ones we can track, pretty well all of them come from animals. And the ones we can't see from animals probably came earlier on in you know, in historical time sort of thing. But anyways, so you expect that viruses come from animals to humans. You expect this is another example. You just don't know. You got to see that. You know, the first SARS, that was 2003, they found its closest relative in civet cats, and then it came from bats. And they found the closest relatives in bats. It took them about 12 years to find that, though. They had to do a lot of search and sifting. So I'd say it's an unknown right now, and I think you're getting out on the end of the branch if you say you know what's going on right now. Right. But if you look at history, you expect it came from nature. But with the abilities we got in the labs now, people say, and people worry about labs more than they do about natural viruses, it seems. You know, the scientists are going to kill them. But there is a bias that came from the lab, but right now the evidence isn't there to look at.
We have heard on the news here that President Obama, when he was in office, he actually cut the funding of gain-of-function research. When Dr. Fauci came, well, Dr. Fauci never left the government, but when President Trump, I should say, came into office, Dr. Fauci pushed that funding back into play for gain of function. That was a lot to do with that research that was going on in the Wuhan lab. So doesn't that make you, though, feel a little skeptical that, you know, it seems like President Obama had the good judgment to cut this funding because it was, I guess, I mean, I don't know anything. I should let you talk about this. But so before I put my foot in my mouth, but it seems like President Obama did have that good judgment to cut that funding, because it seems like that funded this Wuhan lab. And if it did, like I said, I'm not trying to push conspiracy theories, but if for some reason it did come out of that lab, it's almost a U.S. death trap that we were funding this lab, and then it, came out and it killed millions of people on Earth.
Well, that's a tricky call. And maybe let's just back up a little bit and talk about
Sure.
They stopped this so-called gain of function research around 2016 thereabouts.
Right.
And they shut it for a few years, and then they started it up again. And so it was really through an experiment. They were working on bird flu at the time, and so everybody was worried about H5N1 bird flu from China because it was infecting some people and killed about half of them. That never took off. But so they took that virus and they put it in ferrets, and ferrets are they act like humans do when you infect them with human flu. So they sort of like it as a model. So they took this bird flu and they passage it through ferrets. You infect a group of ferrets, you take the virus out of their lungs, take a new group of ferrets, put the virus in it, you sort of push the evolution. Take a lot of virus, run it through ferrets over and over again, and you get variants which now kill ferrets. And so they wanted to know, well, what changed? As they looked at the mutations, gave them a first idea of what it takes to pick a bird virus and get it running through a mammal, in this case, a ferret. And so some people said, well, that was irresponsible work because the ferrets are sort of simulate humans. They're not the same, but people are saying that's too dangerous to do that work, and so don't do that work. So you got a tricky thing where you've got virologists and they're saying, well, you guys should tell us how viruses work and how they behave. And then you got viruses that come out of nature. We see it happen, but we don't know exactly what goes on. And so viruses try to simulate this in the lab, and they do the work, and people say, well, that's too dangerous. And so you get the problem with, like, even with the first SARS, they have the first SARS, where does it come from? And so you got people in this Wuhan lab isolating bat viruses, horseshoe bat viruses. They found horseshoe bat viruses were very similar to this SARS coronavirus, the first one, not number 2, which we're at now. But when they took those viruses from bats, they said, well, what does it take to make a bat virus into a human transmitting virus? So they took the surface protein, the spike protein that we always hear about, it's in the vaccine, right? They took the gene for that from the SARS, from the first SARS, and put it into a bat virus and asked the question, does it infect human cells? Well, it infects human cells really good after that. And they did this experiment in the Wuhan lab. This is the experiment that was funded originally by, I guess it was Obama, and then it got canceled later on. But that was an experiment where people said you shouldn't have done that. But it's the sort of case of, well, it's key information you have to try to understand if you're going to understand how viruses emerge and move amongst animals and jump and start a pandemic. So you can say it's too dangerous, but it's the sort of experiments they have to do to sort of nibble away at the knowledge database. How do these things, how much change you need, what sort of changes do you need? But that all being said, it became a big football when they did this experiment in ferrets. They stopped these so-called gain of function. And it was really too bad they called it gain of function, because in viral genetics, you can either beat up the virus, damage the gene, see if it still works, or you can try to see what makes it work better, go to another species, that sort of thing. So that's called gain of function. So to really understand how viruses work, you really do have to understand how these gain of function mutations work. And so now they sort of want to backtrack from saying, oh, we don't really want to cancel gain of function research. We just want to stop dangerous research. And so the nomenclature gets a bit mixed up. Really what you're trying to do gets a little mixed up. And right now they're in the case of they're nervous about, lab accidents, making a pathogen, letting one out. And yet they still have to do research on pathogens. Otherwise, you sit around on your hands and you wait for it to happen and you work as fast as you can to fix it.
Well, Professor Brown, I want to just say that I'm not against science. If we didn't have good science, people would be dead at 30 or 40 years old like they used to be. So, so I agree with you as far as science goes. We need to trust the scientists and believe in the work that they do, because it is God's work. So my thing was with Dr. Fauci is, regardless of the science, if you say, hey, we don't, because he came out and said, we don't have enough masks, So we didn't want to tell people to load up on masks because, you know, we didn't have enough. And obviously that goes to the outsourcing of jobs in China. We could go down that road a different, and that goes to not just masks, that now goes to ventilators and everything else we need to stay alive in a pandemic was been outsourced in this country to China and other countries. But my thing was with Fauci is he could have said, listen, we don't have enough masks, but let's make our own masks. You know, there's people all around the country throughout coronavirus that were making masks, whether they were as good as the surgical masks, probably not, but at least it was something there. And with President Trump, we look back to what President Bush, who I don't agree with politically, but we look back with what he did on 9/11. We're going to go and kill the terrorists who did this to us. President Trump did not have that moment. This was his moment to stand up and say, listen, we have a serious virus. People could die. A lot of people could die. Let's come together as Americans, believe this virus is real, take care of each other, put on a mask, help each other out, regardless of that. And he would have for sure got reelected. I believe that truly in my heart, because that's why I believe Bush got reelected in 2004. So, you know, I guess that's more of an American politics question. I know you're over the border, but what do you believe of those two situations, that if those two men actually took the leadership to do those two things, we would probably be in a hell of a lot better place now here in this country?
Well, I agree with your last point. You'd be in a better situation if people just wore masks more often.
Right.
But then it started out very messy. You've got your top doc down there saying, you know, can't really recommend masks. We're not sure how important they are right now. And then in the back of his head, we don't have enough masks. He doesn't share this at the time. It's later on. He sort of adds that in. And so he was in a bit of a fog then because, you know, I've studied influenza for decades. We argue forever about how important the aerosol and how important the hand-to-hand contact is in different settings. And it's really tough to study, you know, aerosol transmission. You still have to get close up, and how do you know it isn't the hand-to-hand? You know, it's always hard to do good experiments. In the pandemic, there was so much disease, they're able to do the experiments pretty quickly and then say pretty quickly, yeah, if you wore a mask, a lot less people got infected around you. And if you wore it, you're a little bit less chance of being infected from other people around you. So it's a win-win on both sides. And like, what's the big deal? But unfortunately, the whole concept got weaponized. You got all the people that pick some misinformation or poor information. Oh, masks are bad for your health. You know, they're bad for your lungs. You know, it took forever to try to convince people, you know, docs and surgeons wear these all day on an 8-hour shift, you know, like no big deal, you know? And so it got very confusing. And then it got to be, well, you're some sort of a nut if you wear a mask, and you're hyper reactive, and you know, suck it up and you know, get out there and you know, it's no big deal. And so unfortunately, the mask situation probably didn't help a lot and actually made things a little bit worse. And so yeah, I think it's unfortunate, and it's still a big issue. Like you've got states, you know, Florida down there saying that you cannot make a regulation that you have to wear a mask, something to that effect, you know, like, you know, let it be, you know, wear a mask, be safe for whatever margin you've got, and, you know, use all the tools you've got.
Well, I want to ask you this, just because you brought up Florida. At the beginning of the pandemic, Florida was pretty bad, not as bad as New York and California, but it was having its days where it was getting 3,000, 2,000 cases at least. Sometimes I even saw 7,000 cases for a couple of weeks. We saw that the governor did not really put strict enforcement on masks throughout the pandemic period down here in Florida, which I'm not a big fan of this governor, and he was very allied toward President Trump. Regardless of that, we saw that Florida's cases were not as bad. And we could say that's maybe because Florida is more spread out. I've heard talks, and I want you to clarify this, is because Florida is so warm and the virus doesn't really get out as much because of the warm temperature in a state like Florida, whereas in New York, it's a lot colder. But also that doesn't make sense in a state like California, that's also a warm-weathered state, and it also had extremely bad coronavirus. So what is your opinion on that? Is that true that if it's a warm-weathered state, it won't be as bad than a cold-weathered state? Is that just BS?
Well, no, there's science behind that. So they look
Okay.
at transmission of influenza, and they've done transmission of coronavirus as well. And they do the environmental thing, like what is the relative humidity, the temperature, you know, how damp the air is and stuff. And they find that and cold and dry favors the virus getting from person to person, whether it's flu or coronavirus. And so there's your seasonality. So winter's worse than summer because the hot, humid does not favor a virus surviving very long and getting from one person to the other. So that science is sound. But you talk about Florida, and Florida has done pretty well, even though you might criticize them for not being very responsive, not being a little bit more hands off, you know. But you look at the hot weather and say, well, maybe that helps Florida. But you mentioned California, they're hot and they're doing poorly. And you look down in places like Brazil, they've had a heck of a time, and they just came through their summer. And their summers beat our summers hand downs, you know. And so, you know, sure, there's seasonality, but it doesn't seem to be the trump card. It's in there, but it doesn't. It's not like you're scot free in the summer and you're in real bad shape in the winter. It has an effect, but we're seeing places that have hot climates, just like Brazil through their summer, where we're going through winter. They had a heck of a time with bad outbreaks. So. You know, the seasonality can help you, but it's not going to get you out of the whole thing. But looking at Florida, I really can't quite figure out Florida, nor Texas. Texas is more hands off than Florida about saying, you know, precautions and that sort of thing. And both of them are doing not too badly, you know. And Florida, it's a retirement state. It's full of elderly. Those are the soft targets, you know. Those are the people you bury. You know, over 80, you know, you get about a 20% mortality rate with this virus. Over 70, you're down to around 2%. 60, you get down into what most of the younger people get, you know, about 0.3% die, you know, from the infection. And so big age response. But I'm surprised that Florida didn't get hit more, because they got lots of elderly, and, you know, they got a pretty large population down there, a lot of centers. But that being said, they've done pretty well.
Well, we're actually seeing here in Florida, especially in Central Florida, where I am, they're seeing a lot of that Delta variant is starting to really catch on here, which is a little scary. Even though I do have my 2 vaccines from Moderna, and I've had them for quite a while now, it's still, you know, it's still a little scary that that's going to really kick into gear. We saw what happened to that with that virus in India, and it was really scary what it did over there. I'm not sure if it's still as bad as it was rather in India, but it was extremely bad.
Yeah,
So,
well, India had the Delta variant started in India, and
right.
it hit them hard, and they really took their eye off the ball, because they started vaccinating. And India is a great big vaccine producer. They're one of the biggest in the world for generic vaccines.
Oh,
And so they've been making lots and shipping them around, but their number vaccinated when things got really bad was only a few percent. They weren't really vaccinating their own people. So when the death rate went way up, they filled their hospitals and couldn't handle it. They're really pushing their vaccines. But the Delta variant is definitely a problem. Like, it transmits but twice as good as the first variant that came out of China, and it puts more people in hospital, you know, per person, sort of thing. So, and the vaccines, the good news is, if you have Moderna or the other mRNA vaccine, they work about 10% less well for Delta virus. But if you go to the standard virus you started with, they'll keep 95% of the people out of the hospital. Pretty good number. And essentially everybody from dying. Very few die if you're vaccinated. But when you bring in the Delta, your number softens about 10%. So you're still pretty good. You're in the game, but you. And so the people, you just sort of worry you don't get more variation of this virus, and it ducks the vaccine more. We're just hearing recently the Pfizer's talking about making a booster shot with the variants in it, in case we can't handle the variants, which makes a lot of sense, because you have to do these things beforehand, not be sitting there and say, gee, we can't handle this. Let's make another form of the virus for the vaccine, and then start again. You have to sort of get these things, because it take a few months. They'll have to do a little trial again. You know, they won't have to take as many people, but they'll have to test it out on a smaller group of people, say the new vaccine is still good, and that sort of thing. So you have to think about these things in case you need them.
so are you worried about all these different variants? Because, you know, like I said, here in the US, it's 67% right now, last time I checked. Obviously, it'll probably go up a little bit more, but we'll never, I feel like, hit 90 or even 100%. There's no chance of that because there's always going to be skeptics regardless of that, like there is of any vaccine. With that said, are you worried about if we, just hover around 60, 70%, then there's going to keep being different variants and it could catch up to the vaccine in general?
Well, you do have that scenario that is of concern, that the virus keeps changing and your immunity from your vaccines or previous infection doesn't protect you from an infection, you get reinfected. And so that is a big concern, and especially if you got a good part of your population, about a third, who aren't infected. What you see in other countries, looking at in Israel, they were very high vaccine coverage, but not as much coverage on their youth, right? For one thing, it's not licensed under 12 years old, and less of the youth have been covered there. And so if you look at Israel, they're having a lot of cases, but it's in their teenagers because they're not covered as well, and it's spreading in an unvaccinated group. And so you worry about, but the good news is they're not getting many deaths and not many hospitalizations. And so that's because they do have a good vaccination rate. But if you take a country like the US and the variants keep spreading, the unvaccinated will get hit really hard, and the hospitals will have to cope with those people. The vaccinated people hopefully will do pretty well and stay out of the healthcare system and not require this medical treatment. So that's sort of the good news. But if you have too many people unvaccinated, they can tax your system. Young people don't tend to die, but that's when they've got into the hospital. A lot of them get intensive care. If you didn't have that intensive care, you're dead. You only have a few hours after you get respiratory distress that you're gonna be cashing in your chips. So a lot of people who aren't in the high risk groups, the elderly, are thinking, well, I'm healthy, I'll be no problem. But the thing is, if you don't have your hospitals to back you up when you get a severe case, then you turn into a mortal case. So a scenario that you think is under control will not necessarily stay under control if your healthcare system breaks.
But first of all, how is Canada as far as, we've talked a lot in this episode about skepticism with the vaccine, skepticism about the virus in general, and how it's affected the US. How has it affected Canada? Is it as bad as the US, or is it not even bad?
No, we still have vaccine hesitancy, and you've got the anti-vaxxers, which you can't change their mind, I don't think, the hardcore, because ideologically they know where they are. But right at the beginning, when they did surveys, the pandemic just started, new vaccines weren't licensed, and they were asking people, will you get these new vaccines? And the numbers then were around 2/3, maybe around 60% said, I'll take it. And then since then, the most recent poll is up to 90% of Canadians saying, yeah, I want that vaccine. And so that's a pretty good number to work with. Still have to get the people vaccinated. We're getting there. We're up. I can't tell you the first shot status, but we're up near the top runners in internationally.
But is that because politics was kept out of this, unlike America?
I think partly, they tried to leave it straightly public health, the science, and what's good for you, and what are the problems. And I think, and trying to keep people abreast. We have our National Advisory Committee on Immunization, makes our immunization policies. They spoke up and were the lead voices, and our public health people followed. And then other people like me talk about, the details and whatever. But I think the public were informed, and they generally accept the vaccine as the best tool we've got. Vaccines have saved more lives in healthcare than any other technology in healthcare. You're mentioning just earlier on that a lot of people used to die from infectious disease. In 1950, about 70 years ago, about 20 people in 1,000 died every year from infectious disease. Well, that's been knocked down to 8 out of 1,000. And so that is really a lot of people. When you look at that's about 1% of your population dying every year from infectious disease. Now they don't. And so if you look at since 1950, there's a whole lot of people walking around that would have died without vaccines, modern medicine. And, you know, we've got standard of living, you know, nutrition and stuff, that's important too. But there's a, you know, part of the reason why we got a pandemic is we got an aging population that has a lot of people who would have died before from infectious disease, but, you know, medicine's kept them alive. There's a lot of people with diabetes. That's a high risk for COVID death. You know, we've got a lot of comorbidities, people with transplants, immune system problems. So, you know, we're a softer target now. You know, it's great that we don't die from infectious disease, but we are a bit of a softer target when a new one comes around.
So I want to hit a lot of these topics because I think it's really important, especially in this time. So right now we're seeing, as far as the vaccine hesitance goes, can you clarify and debunk a lot of this stuff? Because we're hearing a lot here on US news that a lot of these vaccines have severe side effects after the first shot, after the second shot. Can you debunk a lot of that stuff?
Well, maybe we just talk about it, what you expect when you get the vaccine.
Right.
And so what is a vaccine? A vaccine is something that gives you immunity against an infectious disease. And so instead of getting the infection and getting immune, where you take the risk of death or dying, whatever is associated with the disease, you get vaccinated, where you get your immune system to make an immune response so that when you do get the infection, it stops the infection. And so here, when we're talking about SARS coronavirus number 2 causes COVID-19, they've taken the spike protein, which is the little knob on the outside of the virus, and the virus uses that to stick to our cells and get inside. So what you do is you vaccinate people with a piece of this spike protein. Your immune system makes antibodies and killer T cells, which is sort of the way your immune system works, against the spike protein. So when the virus comes along, the antibodies glom onto it, and the virus can't bind to your cells. It's been locked out. And so it's a key feature. And so they've made these, the mRNA vaccine. So that's a new technology. So mRNA is messenger RNA. And so in life, all of our genes are in the DNA in our cells. DNA gets copied into mRNA. So it's the same language, a different script. And then that mRNA gets read into protein. So it gets translated. So that's when we make proteins. So our bodies are made out of proteins. The spike protein is a protein. You know, it's tissues are made out of protein. That's life, you know. So you get the mRNA, which is the code for the spike protein. That's injected in your arm. And that bit of mRNA is coated with fat. It's got a lipid coating on it, makes little particles. And that lipid sticks to your cells. It binds to them, it dumps that mRNA into the cells. The cells say, oh, this is mRNA. Your machines in their ribosomes, they make proteins. Now the cell's got protein. What's this? Oh, this is a foreign protein. Immune system says, we're going to react to it. And so your immune system starts, you look for cells in the immune system that can see the spike protein by binding to it. When it binds to it, it turns them on. Oh, we're going to make more of these cells to make the right antibody. And so the immune system is ramping up. It's sending molecules all over your body to tell the rest of the immune system, come here, hurry quick, we're making an immune response. And these molecules can make you feel sort of sick sometimes. They give you inflammation. The immune system works through inflammation. It's an inflammatory process. So you get injected, you start, and that involves inflammation. So inflammation, that's heat, swelling at the site of injection, some pain. And so 40% of people are going to have the sore arm effect. You got injected in the arm, the immune system's responding, you get some inflammation in that arm. That's normal. Maybe a quarter of people are going to get the fever, the headaches, nausea, chills. They feel like they've got an infection because a lot of your infection is due to your immune response. And so the vaccine is mimicking some immune response, some inflammation, you feel some sickness, but it should be a period of a day or 2 or 3, and then you're back to normal. Now, some people are going to get this immediate reaction, and it's going to be fairly strong to put them in bed. So some people are in bed for a day or 2 is sort of the worst case you get for this immediate reaction after your vaccination, and then you're up and about. And then the thing is, this is a 2-shot vaccine. You get your booster, minimum 3 weeks later, usually longer. And then you usually feel a bit worse after your booster because your immune system's already amplified to this virus, but it gets amplified again. So you get more of the same usually. So if you got some reaction on the first one, it means you usually get more reaction on the second one. Not always though, but the second reactions are stronger than the first reactions. And then you've got your virus vectored vaccine, the Johnson & Johnson, you guys have licensed down there. That has a fairly similar type of these immediate reactions you get to vaccination, which is just your immune response. And you shouldn't be freaked out about that. You may be pissed off if you feel pretty achy and sick, but that's partly the currency of the game. You've got the severe adverse reactions. Those are what you don't want. Those are like life-threatening, or you're going to go to the hospital. And so for the virus vectored ones, they have a clotting syndrome. They call it VIT, vaccine-induced clotting associated with destruction of thrombocytes, you know, the technology, whatever. But long and short, get the vaccine, and it leads to some people making some antibodies to your clotting cells, your platelets, and your platelets get blasted out, and associated with that, they're getting some clotting. Not too common. It's like, we're talking more about 20 people per million, not to sneeze at, but 20% of those will die. So you're talking about a death rate about 4 per million from clotting side effect from that vaccine, which is, you know, when you compare it to the death rate from the vaccine, there's no question that the vaccine is very, the cost benefit is very favored, and vaccine is much safer than infection, where you're going to get much higher death rate from a million infected, especially if you're in the elderly groups.
Is that what we were seeing in the AstraZeneca with the blood clots?
That's right. AstraZeneca was associated with blood. Johnson & Johnson has the same side effect. And then if you're talking about the mRNA vaccines, they have less incidence of severe adverse reaction, but they've got a severe allergic reaction more in a few per million. It's pretty rare. They get anaphylaxis, where your immune system gets triggered so strongly it can essentially block your airways and kill you. They've seen very few of that. They know what to look for. If it happens, they give you the EpiPen essentially, and they can take care of you. So that's a fairly serious reaction, but the numbers for that are even, well, they're very, very, very low. And they have that for the mRNA vaccines. And then they're getting some heart inflammation. Numbers are a bit higher than that. It's about 50 per million. And that's mainly young, healthy men. So men from 12 to 30 sort of thing. And especially with their second shot, they're getting about 1 in 20,000 of those people, I say 50 and 100, will have heart problems, will have pain, maybe heart difficulty breathing, fluttering heart. They may go into the hospital for a few days, but they're not dying from it, and they're getting therapy for that inflammation to quiet that inflammation. So I've given you sort of the nitty gritty of what you don't want to hear, but you know, I think people should maybe think of when they watched television last night and somebody's promoting something for arthritis or this, not for this, and the list of side effects was horrendous. You hear after, these are standard drugs that we're used to. But the difference here is that the drug you take for arthritis is given to arthritic people. The vaccine is given to everybody, healthy and whatever alike. And so the standard is higher for a vaccine. You're giving it to healthy people to try to prevent a problem. That being said, we do have some serious adverse effects, but the numbers are low, very low for the mRNAs, and they're still manageable for the virus vectored vaccines.
I appreciate you telling the listeners and the viewers all this important information, because there is a lot of skepticism out here, especially with young people, because they think they're macho man or macho woman and they can survive anything. Meanwhile, you know, you never know, you know, a lot, like I personally have asthma, and I was scared to death that if I would get this virus, then I could drop dead at any second. So that's why I made it my business to go out and get this vaccine as fast as I could. So I appreciate you telling all the viewers this, because it does mean a lot to me. And I'm sure hopefully a lot of these viewers will take this to heart and get out and get the vaccine if they haven't. So thanks so much, Professor Brown. I appreciate your time tonight.
Okay, well, thanks, Robert, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to give some information. And I appreciate people in the media like yourself who make it their business to get the news out as straight as possible to people.